Good day, Baylor family. I'm Darryl Powell, doctoral candidate, Baylor University. And first, I want to just thank the esteemed committee members, Dr. Vaughn, Dr. Ray, and Dr. Scott, for taking the time out of your day to look and discuss my dissertation, Problem of Practice, exploring North Carolinian elementary teacher perceptions of the emotional intelligence and Black student academic outcomes relationship, a qualitative case study. I want to just take a moment to specifically shout out my advisor, Dr. Vaughn. Thank you for all of your leadership and guidance. And I look forward to walking you through this presentation. So let's move forward. So on the agenda, you guys have seen this a million times. We're going to touch on several topics of the dissertation or problem of practice research here, ranging from problem statement to literature review to purpose statement and research question, theoretical framework. We're going to spend some time talking about the methodology, overview of findings, integration of findings, and then culminate that with a literature visual that connects those. We're going to discuss implications and recommendations, limitations of the study, and then we're going to give a brief overview of the distribution plan and some of the selected references that were used to aid this research. So let's jump right into it. So as the title on the screen says, our problem statement. So at the core issue of my study, we want to address the lack of emotional intelligence in teachers exacerbates the racial opportunity gap for Black students, leading to systemic challenges and negative academic and personal outcomes. To really give some context around that, you can break this question down into kind of three different parts. The lack of teacher emotional intelligence, or the lack of perception, the increased racial opportunities that Black learners face with systemic barriers and fewer instructional resources, and then how that leads to the negative student outcome. Just as a frame of reference here, the literature for my research, specifically around emotional intelligence, is kind of laid out in a couple of different time frames. This topic of emotional intelligence per se has been fluid and ongoing for almost 100 years, starting with Thorndike in 1920. That really starts to conceptualize social intelligence, meaning the ability to think about intelligence not just from the binary standpoint of X's and O's, math and science, some of the core fundamental things that we base intelligence off of. But Thorndike really starts to say, hey, is there another way for us to look at intelligence in a social format? And then jumping way ahead, you start to get into the 90s with Salovey and Meyer really taking some of this foundational empirical research and really publishing papers to define more closely what emotional intelligence is and making it really a distinct topic within its own. We have the groundbreaking 1995 book by Daniel Goldman that really looks at emotional intelligence and popularizes this concept in the mainstream by bringing a very robust framework. And then further down the timeline, you start to see that fluidity start to expand through scholarship and also questions arising about the validity of emotional intelligence and who it serves and the validity of its measurement. And we'll go deeper into that as well. Let's move forward on our purpose statement here. So the purpose of this study is to explore elementary school teachers' perceptions of the influence of emotional intelligence on the academic development of African American students in a North Carolina charter school. We're going to move forward here and expound on that purpose by really outlining the research question. The research question aims to provide insights into how teachers' understanding and application of emotional intelligence concepts can support the academic development of Black learners in a charter school setting. And so, like the problem statement, I want you to think about this research question into kind of like three quadrants here. Understanding teachers' perceptions of emotional intelligence. That's the first kind of quadrant. The second, the influence of EI on Black learners, right? And then third, those emotional intelligence concepts and how they are deployed in the classroom. And so hopefully this research question gets to the bottom of exploring those perceptions by teachers. This is going to bring me to the theoretical framework that really is binding this research, and that's Goldman's EI model in 1995. As you can see on the screen, Goldman, although not necessarily the father of EI in its conception, did take a lot of the empirical research from folks like Thorndike and Meyer and Savalvi to really conceptualize a framework around emotional intelligence. Up until 1995, there was no real framework that really took the definition of EI and paired it with how are we supposed to compare it? How are we supposed to engage with it? Goldman does this by authoring a book around emotional intelligence in 1995, highlighting 5 components: self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. So, the methodology for this study is a qualitative case study, which seems appropriate because what we're doing is we are exploring the perceptions, right? So my research site is a charter school in North Carolina. I had a participant selection of 4 elementary school teachers at this charter school. We data collected with semi-structured interviews and a focus group, and that led to, on the analysis side, of really exploring the thematic analysis of these interviews and focus groups to really put into perspective the lived experiences of these teachers. And also, obviously, this methodology would not be complete with the ethical considerations that are provided by the university and IRB for the confidentiality and the guidelines that aid this study. So let's jump into some of the fun stuff, the overview of the findings. So what I know it's you don't want to put a whole lot on the screen here, but I'm going to do my best to conceptualize this in a way that makes sense. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about the 3 overarching findings at a macro level for this study. And it's really simple in a lot of ways, but it also can have some complex understandings. So we understand here that through this research, with the findings, teachers' EI does enhance the African American student environment. Teachers with high or I would say an observed level of EI do create learning environments for students that are conducive to positive outcomes. This creates a more engaging learning environment. And that's not just from the perspective of good grades or good behavior, but what it allows for those educators to make connections in areas that sometimes are completely missed. This can be cultural, this can be socioeconomic, this can be a lot of, different connections that are typically not laid out in a teacher's experience, right? But also we see that the findings show that there is a lack of consistency in EI perceptions. It's essential that these teachers have a consistent EI practices and perceptions, because without that consistency or lack of consistency can aid in a lot of misinterpretations and also a lot of missed opportunities for Black learners in this case. So in this regard, we had 4 participants. We'll call them participant A, B, C, and D. And all of them had shared experiences that did align with EI. But where the research starts to really point to some discrepancies is how all of them had a lack of consistency in how they perceive their EI, specifically in areas of, let's say, like motivation and self-regulation, right? So, like I said, on the flip side, on one side, you see that yes, EI does enhance the student environments, but on the opposite side of that, there is a noticeable lack of consistency in how teachers perceive and apply it. So yes, so I think that it's important for us to really highlight the integration of these findings in the literature and in two major components. The research paper, obviously, or dissertation goes into this in a lot more detail. But for purposes of this presentation, we see two themes of positive classroom outcomes and benefits for Black students, right? And these themes are supported by the literature. You know, Goldman does suggest, along with other folks in scholarship, that hey, EI does promote positive outcomes in the classroom or in an environment, right? And then we see that from a cultural standpoint, as it relates to Black students, that there is a benefit to Black learners because EI can help bridge some of the cultural and emotional and social systemic questions and challenges that oftentimes marginalize Black students. And in a lot of ways, teachers are not always prepared to apply their EI to those types of challenges, right? And so we see that when the perception of EI is consistent or is understood, the application of that does benefit Black learners. So let's talk about some of the implications and recommendations. So here, you know, you're going to see on this chart, we have kind of three different groups of key decision makers: principals, teachers / researchers in the State Department of Education, in this case, the state of North Carolina. And what you're just seeing is a different views of the folks that interact with education at a macro level, and then how that can drill down to how my findings implicate and recommend some of these EI practices or the perception of it, right? So we want to talk to those school administrators and policymakers, those K through 5 educators and state education policymakers, right? We want to look at things like presenting material to principals that really, you know, highlight emotional intelligence as a means of attack when it comes to the missed opportunities and some of the racial opportunity gaps of Black kids. Hey, teachers can really use tailored workshops to really cultivate their imagination and really put into perspective. And I think this is what's important around that methodology is we really want to promote a consistency of EI, right? There can be so many different perceptions of what EI is or what it isn't and how it applies to you and how you leverage it. So I think those types of things are consistent with what we want in that regard. And lastly, with the policymakers at the state level, hey, we want to give policy recommendations for statewide initiatives and partnerships with different universities to continue to promote EI from a official capacity from the state level, right? And we think that this can have a waterfall effect for how we credential teachers for the required courses that teachers are enabled to take. So, of course, like any study, we have limitations. And obviously, my big two limitations here is it's a small sample size, right? The study only had 4 participants. And then, you know, with the case study exploring the lived experiences of these teachers through their perceptions, we do rely on self-reporting and responses. And sometimes those can be unreliable. So we do want to keep those things under consideration, right? For my distribution plan, simply put, this kind of goes back to the implications and recommendations. We're targeting principals, we're targeting the State Department of Education and educational researchers. Principals at the grassroots levels of schools, the State Department at the macro level for policies for the state, and educational researchers, and really relying on them to address the concerns and build other support to advocate for EI in the classroom as a tool to address the racial opportunity gaps. So I have like 200 references in my dissertation, but here's some of the foundational references, specifically in the history of EI and the modern usage of EI, and then really talking about the cultural dynamics of EI with the perceptions of teachers and how it benefits Black students in the classroom. I want to thank everyone, specifically my committee, for allowing me to give this presentation. I look forward to defending this live and having a conversation with you all about this research and getting different ideas and feedback. I want to thank my family, my wife, my daughter. Again, I could not be more proud of myself for this endeavor, but also I could not do this without the support of all the fine folks at Baylor, my family, and my friends. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys soon.